After France's president, Emmanuel Macron, shocked the country and called snap legislative elections 3 weeks ago, the country is at a crossroads. Polarization has each of the three leading camps accusing the other of radical policies that would ruin France. This episode of Scoop is about time. How do journalists cover historic elections in a deeply polarized country? Well, with a lot of rules. Notably, during campaign season, there's a temps de parole, roughly translated as speaking time, but think of it more as each political group being allocated its fair share of airtime. Here's BFM TV.
The clock is ticking each time a party speaks. Then those durations must be balanced out. The formula is mainly based on the previous election's results, opinion polls, and how actively they're campaigning. The rules apply to television and radio, while written press and social media are exempt.
These are historic elections with complicated rules and record-short campaigning, only 10 official days, the fewest of any election in the history of modern France. That's made it difficult for candidates to deliver well-thought-out political platforms and for the journalists to relay and analyze them. We're currently in the midst of electoral silence laws barring us from even saying the names of the parties or the candidates and discussing their policies. Fact-checker Julien Pain said some of these restrictions make it easier for disinformation to spread.
Television is heavily regulated. Each candidate has limited speaking time, which is very precise. And we don't have a choice. We have to do it. Another challenge comes from electoral silence laws, when we can't discuss politics at all during the election weekend. On the internet, that's absolutely not the case. So imagine there's fake news or a deep fake. Me, as a fact-checker, I'm not allowed to say anything.
Moi, vérificateur, j'ai pas le droit d'en parler.
Well, for more, we can speak to our very own Philip Turle, our current affairs editor at French 24. Hello to you, Philip. My knee-jerk reaction as an American when I look at all the rules here in France, one of the things I have to say is, what about press freedom?
I think that the government would argue that this is probably in the interests of press freedom. That's to say, there is a very strict way that elections are handled in France to make sure that one candidate doesn't get preference over another candidate. One candidate isn't given more airtime than another candidate, particularly on stations like ours or on other state-run media in France, but just not only the state-run media, all the TV channels are criticised and can face fines if they don't respect the rules that are laid down. Now, these rules are all laid down by a special government body, which is called ARCOM. ARCOM is a successor of many other bodies that have all existed since the early 1970s. This particular one since only 2022. It's called the Authority for the Regulation of Audiovisual Communication, and it stipulates that up until the election itself, there has to be parity between the different candidates. No one can speak more than another candidate, and that's all in the interests of the candidates and press freedom, which means that the viewers and the listeners to state radio are not given the points of view more of one candidate from one particular political standing than another candidate from, for example, the complete opposite in their political outlook. And all of this comes to an end, as you've just been saying, 2 days before the rounds of voting, both the first round and the second round, where there is no mention of the candidates, no mention of the parties, no opinion polls. The channels don't have the right to give any information over, which basically is just a way of saying to the public, OK, we've spoken enough, now it's up to you to inform yourselves if you want to, by the press, which doesn't come under all of these constraints, or by social media. But as far as radio and TV is concerned, there will be no more, because you have a 2-day period where you can reflect on who you would like to vote for.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that it doesn't extend online to the social media platforms or the internet. Should it? Should these rules extend online?
Well, of course, when all of this came about, as I said, there have been several of these regulatory bodies in France since 1972. The best-known one was the Conseil Supérieur de l'Audiovisuel, the CSA, the Audiovisual Superior Council, which was in charge from 1989 to just a couple of years ago. And of course, the media scene has completely changed in the last few years. There was no social media back then. There was no internet back then. It was much more easy ability at the time to keep tabs and control what was going on, because basically the only outlet was through state media. There weren't even any 24-hour news stations back in the late 1980s. So the landscape has completely changed. I think there is growing pressure now that some social media, some websites, YouTube, for example, or Instagram, Facebook should be brought under control. I think many people agree about that. But the problem is, how do you do that? It's much more difficult to control social media where they're based overseas, and it's much easier to control state-run and domestic television and radio outlets in your own country. And surprising numbers of French people still do use domestic television as their main source of information. And I think that the main channels, TF1, France 2, France 3, they are all looked upon as being very impartial, good stations where you are going to get free and fair information. So I think that they still have a lot of weight, but it's true that I think in the future there's going to have to be the question asked about whether this is going to be able to be maintained, and if we can't maintain it, what are we going to do then?
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that a recent study saw that France has one of the highest levels of mistrust of journalists in Europe. Philip, you alluded to it earlier. The origins of this temps de parole, these airtime regulations. Tell us more about why they were created in the first place.
Well, the current system goes back to 1986, which is at a time when there was an election between François Mitterrand, who was calling legislative elections, and the arrival of his great rival, Jacques Chirac, as Prime Minister. And there were growing calls that at the time maybe there wasn't enough airtime given to some political parties over others. So a decision was taken that for 8 weeks before the election, there was going to be a system set up which basically depended on two different ways of operating. The first one is those who have the highest scores in previous elections will be given more airtime. And if that's not good enough, then those who have the best campaigns, get the most rallies, get the most people in to watch those rallies, have the best poster campaigns, they will also be given more time because they're deemed as being more serious. And that will also give more clout to, for example, candidates who may appear not in the first round, but may emerge after the first round of voting and be a serious contender for the second round. That was how it was based. And then 2 weeks before the election takes place, that rule of absolute equal time is brought in, which still exists now. If you watch any debates on French television over the past few days, you will see each person who is talking has got a counter
timer,
underneath, giving the actual time that they've spoken, so that at the end of that debate you can see who's spoken more, who's spoken less, and normally they're pretty much equal, which means that no one's getting priority over anybody else. And so then you get to 2 days before the election, and then there's a blackout on any further information. That's all, I think,
the
done in a
electoral
democratic
silence
way in
laws, yeah.
France, so that everybody who's voting knows that they haven't been exploited by one candidate getting more airtime than maybe another candidate, depending on what the political leaning of the station broadcasting of that candidate's manifesto is.
And viewers may have noticed we're often stumbling on ourselves trying not to mention political parties or the candidates' names. Philip, it's worth mentioning that the outcomes of these elections could have a significant impact on public broadcasters.
Well, of course, we've all been confronted over the past few weeks over plans for an overhaul of the audio-visual system
Across the political spectrum.
not only in France, but I mean in many other countries around Europe, but particularly here in France. One of the plans, first of all, the license fee has been abolished. There have been a lot of complaints about that because the license fee is automatically paid by people who pay taxes, and that means that it's funding state media. That's France Télévisions, Radio France, the archive department, the ENA, and also partly France 24 and Radio France International. That's been done away with. So there's a huge question going on there about where the money is going to come from to finance state media. Some political groups are saying, well, we need to recreate some kind of license fee, because state media is very important as an unbiased form of communication for or information for the general public. And if you privatize news outlets, then obviously you're going to end up with a situation like you have in the United States. Now, there are already some news outlets that have been privatized in this country. For example, Europe One, a well-renowned station. There is another station called Say News. And there's a worry, I think, that the owner of that, Vincent Bolloré, is moving more to the far right, and that is something that should best be avoided in state media. But this is a big debate that's only just started.
Yeah, and it's an interesting dilemma because as journalists, we're not able to talk about the biggest headline in the country, these elections, of course. Philip, gracefully taking us through that without breaking any of those electoral science laws. Thank you very much, Philip Turle, our foreign editor. That brings us to our quote of the week, which comes from The Economist magazine's June 13th issue. The Charlemagne column said, quote, "Politicians defiantly demanding voters either back 'em or sack 'em is one of those gory European specialties like bullfighting or Balkan politics. The main concern in Brussels is that Europe will suffer the collateral damage from this gambit of Mr. Macron's. Turning your own country's politics into a flaming mess is seen as a prerogative of national leaders. Exporting that mess to the European level is considered bad form." That's it for this week of Scoop. Thank you all for watching. Please stay tuned to France 24.